Somehow, entering the room always felt like being transported to another world. It felt oddly out of place on board of the giant, Atrocity-class warship, because despite the ship's size, it was one of the just very few rooms that entirely broke with the largely uniform design that almost all other rooms on board had. The floor was covered in a rough yet soft, dirty grey carpet that usually softened any step you took on it, but sometimes that had a soft crunch underfoot instead when you displaced it too much. The walls were clad in a green textured wallpaper that would barely give in should you press against it hard enough on its thicker parts. The wallpaper also seemingly covered the digital clock integrated into the room's wall, breaking the theme of that being the only thing any room on board left uncovered. Instead, there was an ancient-looking mechanical clock with black dashes and hands on a purely white background, hanging in the center of the left wall, that constantly filled the room with a soft but insistent mechanical clicking, and gave a more vague idea of the passage of time than its glowing digital brethren that allowed you to know the exact time of day at just a brief glance. The rest of the furniture consisted of a large cabinet painted in all black that was filled with a seemingly random selection of colourful books, standing in front of the same wall the clock was hanging on. A comfortable, velvety red sofa, over which a protective, brown-beige checkered blanket had been thrown to conserve the material despite constant use of the opposite wall, and a set of a thick, wide wooden table together with two thickly padded black armchairs at the room's far end. Additionally, a single artificial fern was placed in the corner, bravely acting as the playing room's sole decoration. Yet the plainness was what made it so outstanding, if that made any sense. Once you entered, there seemed to be not a hint of the ever-present metal making up the vessel in sight. The smell of the fabric of the blanket over the sofa and the carpet mixed with the papery smell from the wallpaper, and together they drowned out any smell of rubber or metal that might have wafted in whenever the room's door was opened. When you looked up, even the ceiling was covered in a white paneling that consisted either of painted wood or some sort of plastic. And finally, even the constant drone that was just always present and expected on a huge spaceship barreling through space at unimaginable speeds seemed to have been somehow banished from the room, as the only thing your ears would pick up once you had entered was the constant, monotonous ticking of the clock. That was also what filled James's ears right now. That, and every now and then a crunch from the carpet, whenever he took a step that may have been too aggressive or uncontrolled, inadvertently reminding him to slow down. "Are you sure you wouldn't prefer to take a seat? Or maybe lie down?" A firm but melodious voice suddenly asked after his owner had observed James's pacing wordlessly for a good few minutes. James paused and turned in the direction of the voice's origin. "Sorry," he said, letting out a long exhale, and turned to go and sit in the armchair placed on his side of the large table, pulling it back with a hand on his backrest. "I'm making you nervous, am I not?" On the other side of the table, Dr. Tracy's narrow lips curled into a smile as she placed one hand on top of the other, while slowly shaking a screen pen between her pointer and middle finger. She was a woman of vaguely Eurasian descent, with sharp features, light skin and dark eyes, and hair that she wore neck long. As one of many on an exhaustive list of onboard therapists and psychologists, Dr. Tracy was also one of the few people who didn't constantly dress in a military uniform, instead usually wearing a short green jacket over some form of black top. Her neck always sported one from a variety of different chokers and necklaces that she seemed to pick on an entirely random basis, and, just as James had started to do in the past weeks, she usually wore a pair of long black gloves, covering her hands and part of her arms tightly. James also had no idea how old she was, as the facial recognition of his brain constantly placed her somewhere in the wide range between 30 and 50 years of age, completely depending on the situation they were in. "If it was that easy to make me nervous, I would be in the wrong profession, don't you think?" Dr. Tracy gave back, lifting her hand that was on top of the other until her elbow hit the top of the table and gesturing with it openly, while James slowly sunk down into the soft chair, audibly pressing a lot of air out of his padding with his weight in the process. "Maybe, possibly, I don't know," James mumbled, and out of habit he swiped over his face, despite there being no hair to swipe away. They had just gotten done talking through his worries that came from Quist deciding to candidate for the upcoming election as well, and the dangers associated with that. But since that was so far removed from them, and Quist was acting entirely independent from any human influence, there was little his therapist could do than try to help him just deal with it. Dr. Tracy's face returned to a professional blankness while she lowered her hand again, getting into position to possibly take some notes on the tablet in front of her, without looking away from his face. "Do you now want to talk about what has gotten you so restless today?" she asked, as she had surely noticed his legs still constantly bobbing up and down, even after he had sat down. That was a good question. There were a lot of things, really. In fact, basically everything currently happening seemed to have built up within him, leaving no room for any energy to rest and constantly pushing it all to the outside, where it needed to find some use for itself instead. Usually that wasn't a problem, as he constantly had to be on tour anyway, always getting something new to focus his energy on, until it was all used up and he could drop into bed at night. However, whenever he came to this room, he was forced to slow down, and all the focus was on him instead, leaving nowhere for all that energy to go. "I'm not really sure I can answer that," he replied. "It's a lot." "Well, we've got some time," Dr. Tracy replied, sitting up slightly straighter in her chair, and for a moment it seemed like she briefly glanced over towards her clock on the wall. "Maybe you could just start with one thing, and see where it leaves you." One thing, huh? Well, which one thing would be an appropriate place to start? There was the fact that the election, that would be deciding a huge part of his foreseeable future, was just literal days away now, and showed no signs of slowing down in its approach. There was the feeling that his mother had him in a chokehold, despite his attempts at pushback, and the creeping suspicion that him starting to get closer to his old team once again wasn't exactly helping with that, even though it was one of the few things that had granted him some reprieve in recent times. There was also still the looming threat of war, and the ire of some of the galaxy's most powerful people, some of whom he probably didn't even know about, directed onto him, that never quite left the back of his mind. That most of the time would leave him at the brink of panic whenever he allowed his thoughts to linger in it for too long. But in the end, maybe it was best to stick to the main reason he was even here in the first place. In an action that took him more willpower than he would have expected, he lifted his right arm and slowly and uncertainly started to pull the black glove covering it off, constantly feeling a resistance that wasn't there as he did so, before gently laying the synthetic appendage down on the table. Dr. Tracy glanced at the prosthesis interestedly, while James basically stared down at it. So far, the robotic limb had served him well overall. It was responsive, reliable, and a good bit stronger than the natural one had been, without it feeling overwhelming. If he had to describe it, then it was a perfectly serviceable facsimile of a human arm that did its job perfectly fine. However, that was just the thing, because as he looked down on it now with its immaculate synthetic skin without any blemish or mark, the only thing that came to his mind was the same thing that did when he first saw it. It was a perfectly fine arm. It just wasn't his arm. It wasn't even close, just a cheap imitation, literally military grade, but somehow it still seemed to try and imitate the natural limb it had replaced. Of course, that last part was just James projecting something onto the prosthesis. He knew that intellectually. The arm wasn't actually trying to trick anybody. It had no mind of its own. It was simply designed that way. Ever since he had gotten it, he had told himself that he would just have to get used to it, and sooner or later his appearance wouldn't bother him anymore. However, now after some time had passed, and he still found himself reminded of all the scars and marks of his past that had been lost together with his first arm whenever he looked down at the smooth, synthetic skin, he had to admit it. "I hate this thing," he finally concluded, saying aloud what he had internally known for a while for the first time. Immediately, Dr. Tracy scribbled some notes onto her tablet without removing her gaze from James's display, her face remaining a judgment-free, near emotionless mask. Then she waited for a moment, presumably to see if he would elaborate on his own. However, James was busy with the conflicting feeling of a weight lifting off of him now that he had said it, and the simultaneous realization of what that could mean for him settling in. So, in an attempt to nudge him in the right direction, Dr. Tracy said, "And is that just a vague feeling, or can you be more specific?" Oh, he could be much more specific. "Well," James said, and began to open the jacket of his uniform unprompted, revealing the white t-shirt underneath, and freeing his arms from the fabric, exposing them for free inspection, as he placed them on the table. "Take a look at my arms. Do you notice anything?" Dr. Tracy's lips narrowed even more than they already were, as she slightly leaned forward to humour him in his request. "Well, you can certainly tell that one of the two has been a much more recent addition," she mused, and James could tell that she was basically telling him what he wanted to hear, thus letting on that she had a way better idea of what he was feeling than she was saying outright. Still, he nodded at her observations, before briefly letting his right hand glide over his left arm, feeling the bumps and ridges of his scars, even through the slightly numbed feeling of his synthetic fingertips. I never took much pride in my scars before. They've never been some weird badge of honor or anything like that for me, but recently I realized just how much of a reminder of my past they are, James explained after a while, leaving the hand to rest on top of the 5 deep scratches left behind from his first meeting with Shida. After they first took my arm, the matriarch said she had left me the reminder of my dearest on my left arm. At the time she was trying to mock me, of course, but now I realized just how right she had inadvertently been with that. Subtly, Dr. Tracy's eyebrows raised ever so slightly, and barely noticeable lines started to form on her forehead as she quickly took some more notes. It's probably not like that for everyone, but for me, my skin tells a story of my past. Goodness, that sounds weird when I say it out loud, but it's true. You've probably heard that proverb where you can tell a lot about a person from just looking at their hands before. It's basically that. But when I look at my right arm now, it's all gone. The whole picture painted by the life I've lived, completely erased, and replaced by an entirely blank canvas. It's like they managed to take it away from me. It just feels so... He carried on his explanation, but had to stop at this point as he realized what word was about to come out of his mouth. A word that he utterly despised, and the use of which he had renounced time after time again. However, right now it felt appropriate. So steeling himself against the discord he knew it would cause within him, he continued, "Unnatural. Fuck, I hate that word. And look at me, Mr. Hypocrite himself, preaching against the idea of synthetic limbs being something bad on one side, while hating his own prosthetics for the very same reason on the other. A great showing all around." He groaned, frustrated with himself, and fell back against the backrest of the chair, sinking deeper into it in the process, and covering his face with his hands. Through the cover of his hands, he could hear Dr. Tracy speak up again. "So, you're thinking that your feelings about your new arm might be compromising your stance on prosthesis overall?" she asked, and he could hear her shift in her seat as well. "Yes," he said through his hands, before immediately correcting himself with a "no," and finally concluding with an "I don't know." He let his hands sink down again, but didn't look at the doctor, staring up at the ceiling instead. "It's complicated. I mean, I'm not thinking that all prosthetics are bad all of a sudden, and I definitely don't think all of them are unnatural or something like that." He tried to formulate his thoughts, although it admittedly sounded a lot more like he was trying to justify himself. But honestly, what does it say about me when I suddenly change my mind on that as soon as it is about me? Do I say, "not as I do"? Always a great message to bring across. He groaned once more, as he was even losing the attempt at justifying it to himself. "You don't have to justify your feelings, James," Dr. Tracy then said, breaking her natural demeanour for the first time today while still outside his view. "This is an aspect of your most personal life. You're not hurting anybody by admitting that you are uncomfortable, and you're not putting judgment on anyone either. Nobody will hold it against you." "I will," James rebuffed, almost a bit truculently. "Then maybe you should cut yourself some slack every now and then," the doctor suggested, and the statement sounded a lot more serious than it had any right to be. James didn't exactly feel like exploring this part of conversation any further, so he finally lifted his head and looked at the doctor head-on once more. "Well, it's not just me either," he started, and then immediately didn't know how to continue that statement, almost instantly regretting bringing it up in the first place. However, Dr. Tracy had already caught on to what he was getting at, and as he didn't seem willing to continue speaking, she took over for him, briefly lifting the tablet with her notes and looking at it with slightly narrowed brows. "You mentioned before that you were worried about how your friends, and specifically your girlfriend, might react to your new arm in the long run," she said, and after having gotten what she wanted from her notes, she put the tablet down once more. "How have you perceived their reactions to it in the meantime?" Again, a good question. How did he perceive the reaction? Well, hardly for the most part, mostly because he was hardly around them to begin with. "They don't seem thrilled," James replied briefly, and avoided eye contact with his therapist once again. "And how do they express that?" Dr. Tracy asked, digging a bit deeper, and James got the feeling that she was much more interested in the things he interpreted into their behaviour than she was in their behaviour itself. "Not directly," James replied, after taking a deep breath. "They don't comment on it or anything like that. Actually, it seems they specifically avoid commenting on it, but I think it makes them uncomfortable." "And why is that?" Dr. Tracy asked further, briefly stroking a strand of hair away after it had fallen in front of her face when she looked down to take some notes for the first time today. James released a quick breath for his nose. Mostly they just stare at it, he replied, reminiscing. It's the first thing they do whenever they see me, just stare at it. It's the first thing their eyes land on. Interestedly, a single eyebrow raised on Dr. Tracy's face and her lips slightly pursed. But apart from that, they're not behaving any differently? She inquired further, putting her pen down for a second, apparently satisfied with writing down her observations later. Inadvertently, James felt a small sting at the back of his head as he heard the question. That was the question. Did they or did they not? They aren't, or at least, I don't think they are. Or, well... He paused for a moment, seeing Dr. Tracy's eyebrow rise even further, and she put her hands down onto the table once again, as she focused fully on him, even more so than before. And again it took James a bit to formulate his thoughts. Well, this might just be me being paranoid, but I have been feeling like they have been avoiding me. I mean, never directly. They never refuse to talk to me or anything like that, and I've been so busy recently that it's hard to tell, honestly. But I just feel like, even whenever we would have some time for it, they're never actually seeking to be around me. I know that probably sounds needy, but it would be nice to spend more time with them. Dr. Tracy seemed to pause for a moment and deeply narrowed her brow, apparently seeing a problem with that statement that James wasn't fully aware of. But you said they aren't actively refusing to spend time with you, right? She prodded a bit, but James didn't yet see where she was going with this. Yeah? He replied cluelessly, and tilted his head aside, looking at his therapist like she was dense. After all, he had just told her that much. And have you been seeking their company whenever you've had some time for it? She continued, her line of questioning. And suddenly the flaw in his logic started to dawn on James, although part of him remained in denial for a second. Well, no, not exactly, whenever I had time for it, he mumbled briefly, and didn't even have a but prepared to end their sentence with, forcing him to just let it end dead. What about your schedule? Dr. Tracy brought her point home, leaving James basically no room to skirt around the quite obvious truth of the matter anymore. It is true that it is quite full, so full that moments of free time are hard to come by, I imagine. So did you discuss it with your friends so that they know whenever you have some time for it, and they can approach you without fearing to disturb you? James opened his mouth briefly, but his voice died in his throat. It had been a while since he had felt this utterly exposed, and it left him speechless for a second. In fact, she had even been nice enough to not bring up the fact that some of his friends actively could not come and seek him out, as long as he remained in the high-gravity areas of the ship. Finally, all he could utter was, I think I see what you're getting at. Dr. Tracy nodded in a way that made James feel like she was satisfied with finally having figured him out, after the sessions they had already had. Do you think, just maybe, that you have been behaving differently around them? She asked, to keep the conversation going, as well as to further encourage him to self-reflect. Well, I didn't until now, James admitted outright, and almost laughed at the absurdity, reaching for his forehead with his right hand. While he was still busy being the slightest bit baffled at his own behaviour, Dr. Tracy put her right hand onto her left once again, and sat completely straight. Although he couldn't see it, James even imagined her crossing her legs underneath the table, as she looked at him with her neutral expression. If you want my advice, she said, indicating that the help you help yourself part of the session was over now, and the here's my professional opinion part had begun, then I would suggest talking to your friends if you are really valuing their opinions on your new arm. I know it is an uncomfortable topic, most likely for all of you, but sometimes uncomfortable topics have to be brought up as well. However, in the end, it is entirely up to you how you wish to proceed on the matter. It is your arm, nobody else's, and how you feel about it must be the most important factor in the decision. James nodded hesitantly. Then, Dr. Tracy leaned back ever so slightly and briefly broke her professional stoicism, in order to give him a gentle smile as she continued. And if you're feeling like you truly can't handle the topic on your own, then come to me. While couples therapy isn't exactly my specialty, I'm both satisfied and confident in handling that as well, should you need me to. Now James actually let out a brief chuckle. Thank you, he said, which Dr. Tracy immediately waved off. Don't mention it, it's my job, she said. And briefly, James felt like he could feel the same sense of belonging emanating from her that he had felt whenever he entered his laboratory. Actually, I've been wondering if I should talk to your friends anyway for a while now. It seems that they had no psychological care ever since they entered our custody. James softly chortled again. Well, I don't think you are certified for that, he mused, thinking that Dr. Tracy had most likely studied human psychology exclusively, and would therefore not be an expert while working with off-worlders. Dr. Tracy pursed her lips and leaned back in her seat, interestedly turning her head to the side and almost completely dropping her stoic demeanour as she looked at him dubiously. "Is that so?" she asked candidly, and basically invited James to ramble for a bit. "Do you feel like their minds work very differently from ours?" From that point onwards, James admittedly lost the point of the session for some time, as he gladly accepted the invitation to just talk about his friends for a bit. Indeed, he had long felt like their brains worked quite differently from a human one in many aspects. He didn't really know how much his supposed observations revealed about himself. However, his therapist quietly listened to his ramblings without ever stopping him, so there was probably something there that he wasn't seeing. However, trying to get behind how all of their minds worked also helped him self-reflect once more. Or maybe empathetically reflect. He wasn't quite sure. Anyway, he felt like he was getting a better idea about some things as he just talked. And it especially helped him reflect on someone he hadn't brought up earlier, who had confounded him for some time now. At least, he thought it did. "I still don't get it, honestly," Admir said, waving around a piece of some random vegetable on the end of his fork as he spoke. "Like, you were separated for quite a while, right? Shouldn't you two be literally sitting on each other all the time then? I know I would be." His rather insensitive way of bringing up the topic of James's and Sheeta's relationship earned him an ireful look from Nia. Well, it was either that or the fact that he had started to speak with his mouth still full, revealing a rather unappetizing picture of half-chewed food inside of his mouth, although he was still surprisingly articulate despite that. After noticing Nia's evil glare, however, he finally swallowed heavily and immediately had to drink some water, as his attempt to force all of the food down his throat at once went sideways. In the meantime, Sheeta was chewing on a chewy piece of vegetable that she had stolen from Nia's plate earlier, herself, while her teeth and the mouthfeel constantly reminded her that she entirely wasn't made for this kind of food. "Well, for the most part, he's either busy with you, his mother, or his therapy sessions," Sheeta finally replied half-heartedly, while leaning her cheek onto the palm of her hand, lazily scratching at her skin with a single extended claw. "That doesn't leave much time for any sitting on each other." At least that was the easiest explanation. Much easier than, well, James just seems to have literally anything else in his mind right now. Although that was what it was starting to feel like in places. Admir was still busy regaining his ability to breathe with short, powerful coughs. Once he apparently felt confident enough in his ability to speak again, he said, "Well, true that, I guess." It had been Nia who had called both Sheeta and Admir to suggest that the three of them should eat together today, as she apparently was trying to build a bridge between both her old and new acquaintances. Then, suddenly, there was a strange prickly feeling coming from the direction of Sheeta's pocket, along with a loud buzzing noise, startling the feline for a second, making her shoot up with ears, hair and tail raised highly. The humans at the table looked at her in a mixture of amusement, worry and bemusement, while Sheeta slowly realized that the buzzing and vibrating was coming from her new phone, informing her that she was being called. She just still wasn't really used to this thing, so when it went off unexpectedly, it gave her a good fright every time. Slowly, embarrassedly, and accompanied by the bemused laughter of many of the surrounding humans, she sank down onto the bench again while hesitantly pulling the device out of her pocket. At first, she expected it to be the call from Mars that the Admiral had announced would be coming in soon, just as she had expected every call and message she had gotten so far to be exactly that. However, once again, she was wrong. But the name that she saw displayed on the screen instead was almost the last person she had expected to call her right now. "James?" she asked, after quickly swiping the symbol on the screen towards the side that said, "Pick up," and awkwardly holding the phone half in front of her face, as the device clearly wasn't made for someone with the positioning of her ears. Luckily her hearing was fine enough that she could still use it, even while having to hold it at such an inopportune angle. Her saying his name alone was enough to make both Nia and Admir pause anything that they were doing for the moment, so they could try and eavesdrop on their conversation. "Hey, treasure," James greeted her back, sounding awkward and enthusiastic at the same time while he used that nickname that he was apparently slowly trying to establish for her. "I hope it's not a bad time." Sheeta momentarily glanced up at the two she was eating with. Usually, the human hearing was pretty pathetic, and she felt like they had rarely heard anything that wasn't obnoxiously loud. However, in this case, apparently the two had somehow managed to pick up on what was being said on the line, and they both immediately started to shake their head. "No, I was just eating," Sheeta replied, taking their hint. Truth was, until she got that call from Mars, she likely wouldn't actually be busy for a while. Once you're done with that, do you think you could come down to Med-Enter a bit? I have something I want to talk to you about, all of you." James's voice said through the line, and he still sounded rather unsure of himself. Med-Eng. That was where Curie was scuttling around right now, according to that green-haired girl. Although Shada wasn't quite sure what Med-Eng was, she had some guesses based on context clues. Could this be about James hiding his arm all the time whenever he met any of them? Hopefully this wouldn't be something like James trying to do something about his new arm on their account. Admittedly, Shada still wasn't a huge fan of the thing, but still it would be unfair if he felt like he couldn't be happy with it, just because she hadn't come around to it yet. She started to get used to the artificial meat. She could get used to this as well. Sure, she quickly replied, lifting both her ears. She felt like she could at least use the opportunity to reassure him that it would be fine, no matter what plan he had now. So, when do you want me in there? Like, right now, or? Yeah, James immediately replied, but was stifling his enthusiasm a bit and adding, if you have time, that is. Well, she had time. That her meal partners ensured her of, making sure she wasted no time on excusing herself for cutting their meeting short before sending her off. It took a bit of searching and asking around before she found the medical engineering area, because it was located close by, but a few levels down on the ship in a lower gravity area. In hindsight, it made sense, since James said he wanted to talk to all of them, which meant that Moore and Conglorch would also have to be able to be present. So after being lost more times than she cared to admit, and exhaustive directions given by both the humans around her as well as Nia on the phone, she had finally poked her head through the extraordinarily large doorway that led to the predetermined location. The place could best be compared to a large storage hall or maybe factory floor, being huge and open with a very high ceiling. Although the open space itself was broken up in a grid-like system, with footways forming large squares being distributed all throughout the room, in between which workspaces were distinguishable, consisting of workbenches with all kinds of complicated tools on top of them, work desks with computers, and, depending on where you looked, all kinds of robotic-looking apparatuses, supposedly used in one form of assembly or another, although Shada had a hard time imagining their exact functions from just looking at them. They did have a lot of cables, tubes, and robotic arms though. Some of the workspaces were empty, while diligent humans worked away in others. And what they were working on revealed Shada's earlier assessment to be correct. This was the humans' factory of horror, the place where all the synthetic limbs were seemingly created and maintained. Luckily, seeing them like this, still in assembly, largely with exposed machinery, without skin and not attached to anything, they weren't so bad. They just looked exactly like what they were, robotic parts. The thought of attaching one to her own body still wasn't a pleasant one, but the sight of them didn't give her the shivers like their completed counterparts did. Now, just to find James among this gaggle of primates. However, where human hearing was utterly unimpressive to her, her own eyesight left a lot to be desired when compared to that of the even higher class Deathworlds. But she wasn't left to search for long, because after a few moments of futilely looking around, she was suddenly surprised by the feeling of someone reaching for her hand. Start off with the second time today, she tore her arm away and shot around wildly. Luckily, she had by now internalized it to not swat at anyone approaching her unexpectedly, as humans seem to have a knack for not entirely thinking through the way they try to get somebody's attention. Still, although she wasn't heading in his direction, James had still defensively raised his arm to shield his face, as he looked at her surprisingly, inadvertently displaying the traces of what could happen when you unthinkingly approached a Miat on his arm, quite promptly in the process. Shada took a deep breath, coming down from the brief fright, while James awkwardly chuckled as he lowered his arm again. Sorry, he immediately apologized. I didn't mean to scare you. Usually you hear me from a mile away. Well, it's loud here. Shada defended herself at first, before taking one last deep breath and approaching James, allowing him to pull her into a hug. Only as she felt both his hands on her back did she realize that he was not hiding his arm anymore. Without him so promptly pulling it back behind him, she hadn't even paid attention to it. You should probably use your right to block from now on, she mused, as she pulled away from him, nodding towards his right hand and thinking how the scars on his left arm could have gotten a matching pair just now if he defended like he did. She now also noticed that he wasn't wearing his glove. James scoffed amusedly, and also looked down at the robotic appendage. Yeah, you're probably right, he said, lifting the synthetic arm and studying it ruminatively. Even though the synthetic skin wouldn't heal on its own, damage to the prosthesis was a lot less dangerous to his health, even if he technically could scratches like that without much issue. Have you just been waiting for me? Shada then asked, looking around again, thinking that she would at least see Moore's huge form if the old lady was already here. James shook his head. Well, Curie should be around here somewhere, and Moore is probably on her way, he explained, as he also stretched his head as high up as he could in order to look around the room. I couldn't reach Conglorch, though. Seems his people have him in as tight a grip as mine do me. She'd flicked her ears at him playfully, glad that he seemed somewhat relaxed, although there still seemed to be some underlying anxiety that he wasn't quite letting on. Then should we wait for more, or? She prodded, now more interested than ever in what he had to tell her. James seemed to think about that for a moment, narrowing his brows and shifting his lips a few times. However, finally he seemed to decide that Moore's arrival would be pretty hard to miss, so waiting around at the entrance probably wouldn't be necessary. Let's go look for Curie first, he suggested, and put his left arm around Shida. I'm curious what they were up to down here. So he had actually waited for her before even satiating his own interest. That was nice. Somehow. As they made off together, it was easy enough asking around for the black, spider-like cyborg, although it quickly turned out that Curie had seemingly become a sort of household name down here, as one of the usual answers they got was, "Oh, you mean Curie? Their space is over there." That way they had found the cyborg in no time at all, catching them while they were currently working at the human computer on the desk, their frontmost backwards legs once more sprouting these strange chews from their end, using them to clack away at the keyboard, the use of which they had seemingly mastered in the brief time on board the Sun. Next to them stood a human man, who she'd have felt like she recognized, but didn't know from where, looking over their shoulder at the screen and talking to them in a low and slightly exasperated tone. "I understand what you're saying, and trust me, I feel the same way," he said, clearly trying to keep his composure while fighting a slowly losing battle. "But even if you don't want to put a price tag on it, we have to at least put some basic protection onto the blueprint. Otherwise someone else will come along and just claim it for themselves, and then what? Who's to guarantee they won't hide it behind a huge paywall? And unless we've at least registered it as ours, there'd be nothing we could do about that." "It is clearly our invention," Curie rebuffed, and Sheila could almost immediately tell that they hadn't got the man's point at all, even if it sounded like the most natural thing in the world to her. "We have documented the entire development process, as well as the blueprints. Nobody could reasonably claim it as their own." The man, who seemed to have been over this more than once at this point, rubbed the ridge of his nose with 2 fingers and his eyes closed tightly, his brow furrowing, as he desperately thought of another way to bring his point across. "I wish it would work like that," he mumbled while rubbing his eyes. Sheila didn't know how much of the conversation James was able to hear, however. By now the two were in a reasonable range to hold a conversation, and James loudly greeted them. "Hey, Curie. And hello, Doctor." He paused for a moment and then left it at the title, and Sheila suspected that he was trying to hide the fact that he had forgot the name of his own doctor, who she now recognized as well, although she had no more idea about the man's name than James did. "James," Curie said in what must have been one of the most surprised tones Sheila had ever heard them make. It almost sounded like they had been caught in the middle of something they didn't want to be caught in. "I didn't expect to see you here." But Curie wouldn't try to hide anything, would they? No. Or maybe. The doctor's behaviour certainly didn't help their case, as he seemed quite excitedly nervous upon laying eyes on his patient. "First Lieutenant Aldwyn," he greeted James very officially, and adjusted his collar for a moment. "I hope you're not here because your arm's been giving you any trouble. If so, you should have consulted with me first." James waved the man off with his robotic arm. "No, it's still working great," James said, putting a strange emphasis on the word working. "I'm just here to talk to Curie." "Ah, well, in that case," the doctor said, and seemed pretty relieved, although he wouldn't ever get to finish their sentence because Curie quickly piped up, saying, "Could you come back later, please?" Sheila tilted her head at the tone of the cyborg. There was still that air of being caught in there. James either didn't seem to notice or didn't care, because he replied, "Yeah, I see that you're busy, but it really won't take long. Any chance you can take a short break anytime soon?" Curie incessantly shook their whole body in denial. "No," they said firmly. "You're going to work the entire day?" James asked again, his curiosity seemingly turning to worry as he furrowed his brow slightly, clearly not happy about the thought of Curie working without rest. "No," Curie said again, shaking their body once more, "but I can't talk to you yet." James seemed taken aback, and he glanced at Sheila for a moment, but she could only shrug, as she had no idea what that was supposed to mean either. "Okay, if you don't want to talk to us, that's fine," Sheila tried to start, but Curie immediately repeated, "No." Now both James and Sheila were utterly confused. "So you want to talk to us," Sheila started, "and you have some time," James continued in her stead, as there was no pushback from Curie after some wait, "but you still can't talk to us?" Curie bobbed their body up and down in confirmation, replying, "Yes." Okay, this was weird, even for Curie, and James and Shida glanced at each other once again. "And can I ask why?" James finally asked straight out, looking at the cyborg in a mixture of worry and bemusement. "Because it isn't done yet," Curie suddenly exclaimed, the sentence basically exploding out of them, after they seemingly unsuccessfully tried to hold themselves back from revealing the information.